Throughout this feature, the word Select means to move the arrow to something on the screen, then press the button on your control. Anytime during How to Use This Disk, you can select the Return button at the lower left of the screen. Selecting Return will bring you back to this index. Then you can get out of How to Use This Disk by selecting Return again. The two features listed here demonstrate different aspects of Treasures of the Smithsonian. Select one now. Anytime you want to leave this feature, you can select the button at the lower right. This will make the Return button appear in its usual place at lower left. Then you can select Return to go back to the index. Once you've started a treasure presentation, you can just sit back and watch, or you can use the control panel at the bottom of the screen to get more out of the treasure. You can also remove the control panel from the picture by selecting the picture. Try it now. Move the arrow above the control panel and press the button on your hand control. To bring the control panel back, press the button again. Try it now. The button on the left of the treasure title is More. Pause brings up a whole. If you select Skip, if you select Notes, if you select Return, the Smithsonian Institution, the world's largest museum and research complex, began with a gift to the U.S. from a man who never visited America. James Smithson, the illegitimate son of an English duke, looked to the United States as the world's beacon of progress and enlightenment. In his will, Smithson left his hard-earned fortune, $500,000 in gold, to the U.S. government to establish an institution for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. Led by the vision of former President John Quincy Adams, Congress accepted Smithson's bequest and founded the institution in 1846. The first secretary was Joseph Henry, a noted physicist and inventor of the electromagnet. Work began on the first Smithsonian building, the castle. The institution started attracting scholars and collections. From these modest seeds grew a giant. Today, the Smithsonian's 14 museums, galleries, and parks report about 24 million visits annually, far more than Disneyland. Smithsonian research establishments stretch from Massachusetts to Panama, and special projects are carried on all over the world. The collections are so vast that only 1% can be displayed at a time. The Smithsonian's treasures total well over 100 million items. Just to inventory them took 5 years. Chuffing, clanking, hissing, burbling, the sounds and smells and sights of the great steam engines evoke an age of raw power that revolutionized the world. Built in the nation's centennial year, 1876, this Baldwin locomotive stars in the Centennial Exhibition at the Arts and Industries Building. This little engine that could worked originally for the Santa Cruz Railroad in California. It was still chugging away in Guatemala in 1950. John Bull is the world's oldest operable locomotive. Operable? In 1981, to celebrate its 150th birthday, this primitive engine drew an ancient coach crammed with costumed passengers along a stretch of abandoned track at a bonnet-clutching 13 miles an hour. And John Bull's ready to do it again. How about tomorrow? It's the Southern Railway's engine number 1401, but people generally call it the Jolly Green Giant. For about a century, such steam locomotives epitomized power. This one could pull 800 tons of freight at 80 miles per hour. A 3-year-old Smithsonian visitor once stood directly in front of this engine while museum sound effects heightened the illusion that it was ready to go. At this point, the boy's father pulled him out of the way. A line shaft under the ceiling hums steadily, powered by the steam engine of this mid-19th century machine shop. A tweak on a well-worn wooden lever engages a belt drive, and a tool begins its work. The belt slaps, the countershaft sings, the drill purrs, and a wisp of smoke rises from fresh-curled steel shavings. This 1864 mill engine still runs, though no longer on steam. That mighty flywheel whispers around and around, belts slap, cylinders pant, valves click, shafts hum, and the connecting rod pumps with a steady power that awed the 19th century. The Smithsonian's Air and Space Collection draws millions of people, more than any other museum in the world. Why? Because flight, even while it's become a reality, remains a dream. Four big Douglas biplanes set out in 1924 to prove that an airplane could fly around the world. This world cruiser, and one other, completed the historic flight in 175 days. Collectors flock to see this inverted stamp of 1918, which came out 2 days before the first scheduled airmail flight. The flight itself was as jinxed as the upside-down stamp. The pilot shook hands with President and Mrs. Wilson, got in his plane, headed south instead of north, and cracked up in a cornfield. The mail he carried was finally delivered by railway. Through the early 1890s, Otto Lilienthal soared from a German hilltop in one hang glider after another. Lilienthal died in a crash in 1896, but he had given the world valuable knowledge of the curved surface that makes a wing fly. In 1927, the Spirit of St. Louis and its young pilot, Charles Lindbergh, slogged their way across the Atlantic and into the hearts of millions. The 33-hour flight linked New York and Paris, Europe and North America. At takeoff, the plane was carrying so much fuel it barely got off the ground. Voyager, stained and weather-beaten after 9 racking days of steady flight, hangs above an entrance to the National Air and Space Museum. In December 1986, with Dick Rutan and Gina Yeager crammed in its tiny cabin, this delicate space-age airplane pulled off one of the last epic flights, non-stop around the world without refueling. Here is the world's first airplane, the Wright Flyer. The Wright brothers put aside their bicycle business, experimented meticulously, and on the morning of December 17, 1903, had their machine ready on the sands of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. The flip of a coin decided that Orville would be the rider. Wilbur steadied a wingtip as the Flyer whirled along its rail and lifted off. For 12 seconds, it bucked gusty winds, pitching up and down at about the same altitude where it hangs today in the museum. The Flyer flew only 120 feet before it plunked into a sand dune. But that first powered, piloted flight celebrated the new century by raising the roof and offering a glimpse of the stars. When painters and sculptors break new ground, their work often makes a comment about what art is, what it has been, or what it should be tomorrow. Especially in the 20th century, art always seems to be talking about itself. What is it? Well, from here it could be a small collage with scraps of paper pasted on top of each other and some scribbles drawn over some of them, until you notice it's almost 14 feet high. The sculptor, Frank Stella, delights in making such visual jokes about form and scale. Moving closer, you see that all those cones and cylinders are really flat. Most of those overlapping layers really don't, and those casual scribbles are mounted on half-inch slabs of aluminum. The full title, Qua qua attaccati là, is a phrase from an Italian nursery rhyme, meaning roughly, quack, quack, get off my back. In 1909, 28-year-old Pablo Picasso made the first Cubist sculpture, a portrait of his mistress, Fernande Olivier. Taking the hint from painting, he abstracted the planes of the woman's face and hair as if to show her from several perspectives at the same time. Sculptor David Smith's Kubi series is all stainless steel, with shapes that give a hint of the human figure. When you look close, you see filaments of sunlight carrying a design, seemingly from within the steel surfaces. How do you describe such a piece of art as this? It's quiet and understated, yet vaguely disturbing. Mostly sculpture, but also part painting. The title of this work, Medici Princess, apparently refers to the reproduction of a painting on the back of the cabinet, a 16th century portrait by Bronzino. In the drawer is some silk, along with a tiny packet of miniature letters and a feather. New York artist Jackson Pollock dripped paint onto his canvases instead of applying it with a brush. The public scoffed at first, calling him Jack the Dripper, among other things. Pollock wanted to capture emotional intensity in the raw elements of color and form, without representation of any kind. He called this work Number 3, 1949, but it has a subtitle, Tiger, perhaps an afterthought inspired by the threads of yellow and black. Richard Serra's strange arrangement is one of the only places in the Hirshhorn where a fence keeps viewers from getting too close. These thick, heavy sheets of steel are simply balanced on their edges. The bar lying across them holds them in place by weight alone. Serra calls this study of balance 2-2-1, to Dickie and Tina. The first shipload of African slaves reached America a year before the Pilgrims. Starting with almost nothing, Black Americans have made major contributions to our culture.
Will, whosoever will, let him come, let him come.
Frederick Douglass escaped from slavery and bought his freedom with the earnings from his lectures at home and abroad on the abolitionist cause. During the Civil War, he helped raise 2 black regiments, and he was a friend and advisor to Abraham Lincoln. The portrait's handsome case, with its red velvet cushion, served to protect the fragile ambrotype.
How sweet and lovely are those days of which I dream.
Sojourner Truth, abolitionist, suffragist, and evangelist of Civil War days. In 1864, she visited Washington to help integrate streetcars, almost a century before Rosa Parks's Alabama bus ride. Lincoln received her at the White House. She never learned to read or write, but when she talked, huge crowds listened. As she explains under her picture, Sojourner sold copies of this card, her shadow, to pay expenses.
Pray again, my Lord, and if I could hear her tender voice again. Beams of heaven, holy land, as I go.
Harriet Powers, a former slave from Georgia, made this quilt around 1886 using techniques that recall traditional needlework of West Africa. The designs illustrate Bible stories, from Adam and Eve with a salamander-like serpent to the Holy Family under the Star of Bethlehem. Powers didn't want to part with the quilt, but she sold it in 1890 for $5, owing to the hardness of the times. It's just a plain old towel, the kind you find in the shower room of a gym. But what a story it has to tell. As the embroidered words explain, this was the towel tossed into the prizefight ring at Joe Louis's 1938 rematch with Max Schmeling. 2 years before, Schmeling had come over from Hitler's Germany and knocked Louis out in the 12th round. Now Louis had his chance to even the score. He took exactly 2 minutes and 4 seconds to destroy Schmeling. The German's manager tried to end it by tossing in this towel, but the old gesture of defeat cut no ice in a New York ring. The towel was tossed back, and Schmeling, with 2 cracked vertebrae, had to be carried out. Louis's world championship was assured. Blacks didn't break into big-time tennis until the 1950s. Then Althea Gibson, blessed with poise, charm, and lightning reactions, stormed the courts at the U.S. Open and Wimbledon. She won the women's singles 2 years in a row, 1957 and 1958. "30 years later, Althea gave the Smithsonian her racket, her outfit, and 5 trophies. For jazz fans, this is an easy one. That trumpet with the upturned bell could only belong to Dizzy Gillespie, one of the greatest innovators in 20th century music. He's a composer and bandleader as well as a performer. In the 40s, he pioneered in the development of bebop. Early in Gillespie's career, a dancer bumped into his trumpet and bent it. He liked the sound, and ever since he's had angled horns custom made. Muhammad Ali used to say he was the greatest, and a good many boxing experts agree. These are the gloves, signed by the champ himself, that won him the World Heavyweight title in 1974, for the second time. Perhaps it's an inherited crown, perhaps a bulging bank account, perhaps sheer brute strength. Since primordial times, in nature and society, the weak have given way to the dominance of those born to rule. The Smithsonian celebrates the Mesozoic era at Dinosaur Hall, ruled by the 90-foot Diplodocus. Bones from 2 individuals were assembled to fashion this single giant looming above its companions. such as Stegosaurus, bony plates rising from its backbone, Triceratops, with a face like a rhinoceros and horns like a bull, and the ferocious meat-eater Antrodemus. Here stands a special kind of American, Isaac Merritt Singer, self-made nabob of the post-Civil War age of greed. He made a huge fortune by improving on Elias Howe's sewing machine, splurged his money enthusiastically on a series of mistresses, got into trouble for choking his common-law wife, got out of trouble again, and lived out his days in Paris. Portraitist Edward Harrison May caught to perfection Singer's aura of arrogant profligacy. Britain's Henry Moore cast his bronze King and Queen in 1951. What you see as you walk around it is a sensitive balance of realism and abstraction. For example, look at the contrast between the very human hands and the heads, stylized and regal in their simplicity. Horse Chief, a Pawnee leader of the 1830s, stares from his canvas with eyes that have never known fear. The artist, George Catlin, was no John Wayne, just a rather short painter from Philadelphia. But it must have taken guts to persuade this haughty aristocrat to sit still long enough to have his face immortalized. Benin, in Nigeria, was a rich and advanced culture that maintained a cordial trading relationship with Portugal as far back as the time of Columbus. On this skillfully made bronze plaque, attendants and musicians stand on either side of the Oba, that is, the king of Benin. According to tradition, the two bearded Portuguese soldiers in the background may have been the Oba's personal bodyguard. John Singer Sargent, a socially impeccable Bostonian who lived mostly in London, painted portraits with brilliant technique and always managed to flatter his subjects. No wonder he was in demand wherever society's stars glittered. His women, gazing out with such confident hauteur, make you feel intrusive, as though they are coolly appraising you instead of you them. Sometimes the reality around us is just the jumping-off point for imagination and fantasy. Here's a sampling of the gloriously unreal in art and decoration. Shortly before World War I erupted, Constantine Brancusi carved this sleek, seemingly simple marble head, Sleeping Muse. At New York's famous Armory Show of 1913, admirers and critics alike saw Brancusi's dreamlike study of curves and textures as one of the most disturbing images of the new century. This Japanese landscape by Gakuo Zokyu, a 16th century Zen priest, seems to stir earth and sky together. A stylized mountain, inspired by crumpled paper, floats away, separated from the earth by a patch of sky that wreathes around the trees and houses. Thomas Wilmer Dewing reflected a Victorian concept of women, mysteriously exciting but never obtrusive. The spinet, done on wood in 1902, only hints at a beauty that cannot be fully realized. That slender neck, those soft, bare shoulders are as elusive as her music. Carved on this jade bowl from the Qing dynasty are mystical dragons and lions deeply embedded in Chinese folklore. For almost 7,000 years, Chinese craftsmen have fashioned intricate designs in jade, a substance as hard to work as it is beautiful. A stately flock of stylized cranes step across 6 gold screens at the Freer Gallery. According to Japanese myth, cranes symbolize longevity. The lavish background reflects Japan's Edo period of the 17th and 18th centuries, when merchants prospered. To proclaim that newfound wealth, they furnished their houses with masterworks like this one, a blend of luxurious materials and elegant design. What could be more tasteful or more expensive? The pressure of war and the fear of conquest have led us to devise remarkable weapons, as effective as a shark's predatory jaws. The Ferguson rifle is notable because the British Army nearly adopted it in the 1770s. Had they, we Americans would probably have lost our revolution. Invented by Patrick Ferguson, a Scottish officer, this sturdy, accurate rifle was a fast-firing breech loader. Here, the breech plug is open. You just drop in ball and powder, give the trigger guard a twist, and the rifle is ready to fire. The gun was years ahead of its time, and luckily for the fledgling United States, the British Army lacked the foresight to adopt it. Talk about jaws. The great white shark that owned this set grew 40 feet long and had a bite that would engulf a Volkswagen, occupants and all. The jaws were reconstructed to fit real teeth left behind by the monster, who, you'll be glad to know, has been extinct for about 1 million years. During the Civil War, guns got bigger and bigger. The larger of these 2 Rodman guns weighs 25 tons and fired round 15-inch shells, which were raised to the muzzle by a hoist. The Union Army started making Rodman cannons in 1864 and mounted them in seacoast defenses, but by then the Confederate Navy wasn't much of a threat. Probably all the action these monsters saw was target practice.
Fire!
Death is a woman, according to Hispanic tradition, and in the upper Rio Grande Valley of New Mexico, where Spanish and Pueblo Indian cultures first met more than 400 years ago, death is still a woman, a wooden female skeleton clutching a bow and arrow. Her name is Doña Sebastiana. Every Good Friday she rides to the local Calvary, the graveyard. Her processional, a lingering symbol of penitence. Her cart, a primitive engine of death. The Albatross D-5A appeared on the Western Front in 1917 and soon became a favorite with German flying aces. It was an Albatross that carried Manfred von Richthofen, the notorious Red Baron, to most of his 80 victories. Incidentally, when it arrived at the Smithsonian, this Albatross was a pile of tattered fabric and rotting plywood. Then the restorers went to work. Now look at it. Even though we've taken our first steps into space, the night sky remains an awesome display for us Earthlings. Here are a few human responses to the promise of the far stars. Still clinging to the bronze handle of this ancient Chinese dagger is the rusted stub of an iron blade. Yet it was made hundreds of years before anyone thought of mining iron. So, where did the iron come from? The answer is, from the stars. Ancient craftsmen found meteoric iron and reverently fashioned it into the dagger and this battle axe, for use not in battle, but in ceremonies. In the late 1970s, this strange white cube appeared on the 8,500-foot peak of Mount Hopkins in southern Arizona. It's the Whipple Observatory, built jointly by the Smithsonian and the University of Arizona. At its center is the Multiple Mirror Telescope, 6 72-inch mirrors that work intricately together to gather light from distant corners of the universe. Every clear night, the entire building splits apart. Then it rotates on its base, lining up the telescope with its target, and scientists gain a new view of faint and distant stars, galaxies, quasars, whatever's out there. The Bell X-1 was the first aircraft to carry a man faster than Mach 1, the speed of sound. Test pilot Chuck Yeager named this orange needle Glamorous Glennis for his wife. The so-called sound barrier had foiled conventional planes with their thick, lifting wings. The X-1's sharp-edged, fin-like wings made the difference. Dropped from the belly of a bomber on an October morning in 1947, the plane gave Yeager the ride of his life, slipping easily up to Mach 1.06. That flight opened the way for space travel and earned the X-1 a place of honor in the National Air and Space Museum.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
In 1969, Apollo 11 fulfilled the great goal of the 20th century.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
On the day that Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin were walking on the moon, the Apollo 11 command module was in lunar orbit, waiting to take them home to Earth.
Could you describe what you're looking at, over? Roger, you're seeing Earth as we see it at our left-hand window.
Its pilot, Michael Collins, later became director of the National Air and Space Museum. The module now stands about 13 feet from the Wright Flyer, the first successful aircraft. Only 13 feet and 66 years between our first wobbly hop and that giant step. What a century it's been.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Star Trek fans, and there are legions of them, delight in finding this superb model of the Starship Enterprise in the Air and Space Museum. It was used for special effects in the television show, then turned over to the museum. The model tells a good deal about our conjectures of distant space. This craft, of course, is fictional, and yet, so were rocket ships only a century ago. We restless humans always have places to go and always want to know where things are. These treasures, rare, important, and beautiful, are about finding the way. In 1803, Captains Meriwether Lewis and William Clark led their exploration party west from St. Louis. They found their way through the wilderness by following rivers, sunsets, and the advice of their Indian guide, Sacagawea the Bird Woman. They also checked their bearings with a few instruments like Clark's sturdy, well-used pocket compass in its handmade leather case. These sequined ruby slippers helped Judy Garland find her way along the yellow brick road in the magical 1939 movie, The Wizard of Oz. Actually, Judy wore lots of identical pairs of ruby slippers. They had to look shiny new no matter how many times a scene was filmed. This pair eventually found their way to the Smithsonian. Here's the magic that turns a lighthouse into more than just a tall building. This complicated arrangement of glass prisms was designed by a French engineer, Augustin Fresnel, in the early 1800s. His lens magnifies the light of an oil lamp into a beacon visible for miles. Shipping on a whaling voyage in the mid-1800s could mean 3 years at sea. A homesick sailor, aching for his bride, whiled away the hours off watch by affixing little whalebone staves around the cylinder of this telescope. On them he etched a message to his dearest Rebecca. So Rebecca had her own spyglass to carry as she paced the widow's walk of their New England house, waiting for him to find his way home. In the late 1970s, this strange white cube appeared on the 8,500-foot peak of Mount Hopkins in southern Arizona. It's the Whipple Observatory, built jointly by the Smithsonian and the University of Arizona. We restless humans always have Going fast is part of our lives. We study it in nature, we shackle the power it brings, we constantly set speed records and break speed limits. The Smithsonian shows many ways to go fast. No wonder the ancient Olmecs worshipped the jaguar. No wonder manufacturers named a car after this feline predator. Driven by hunger, it can spring on its prey at 60 miles an hour. When you meet it at the Smithsonian's National Zoo, it's not hungry. President Grant liked to go fast. He used this open carriage not only for official occasions, but also for family drives when he sometimes gave the horses their head. Once, dashing along a Washington street hell for leather, he got pulled over by an outraged policeman. The cop, of course, was distraught when he found what he'd done. But Grant told him he was right. Then the nation's chief executive took his ticket, saw his carriage impounded, and walked home to the White House. The only president ever pinched for speeding. This is a bicycle? It sure is. In fact, it's the fastest bicycle ever. It's called the Gold Rush, designed by Gardner Martin. On May 11, 1986, racing cyclist Fred Markham climbed inside and pedaled the bike to a record-breaking speed of just over 65 miles per hour. The Hirshhorn sculpture Boccioni's Fist by Giacomo Balla doesn't move an inch, yet it gives a dazzling impression of quickness. Umberto Boccioni was a painter friend of Balla's. Both belonged to the Italian Futurist movement. At any rate, when you see Boccioni's Fist, you feel you should keep out of his way. After World War II, nuclear scientists began accelerating atomic particles to unheard-of speeds. A team of physicists led by Luis Alvarez designed a straight 1,000-foot-long proton accelerator to boot up the speed of particles, intending to produce a billion-volt atom smasher. Nearly 1,000 war-surplus radar sets supplied the parts. Scientists gained priceless knowledge from building it, but the linear accelerator was already obsolete by the time this first segment was finished. Meet Swamp Rat 30. Piloted by its designer and builder, the legendary drag racer Don Garlitz, Big Daddy to aficionados, Swamp Rat was the first dragster to pass 270 miles an hour in a quarter mile, taking 5 seconds from a dead stop. That long nose holds the road. Those wide tires, heated by spinning on the pavement, grip the surface like tacky glue. The 3,000 horsepower engine gulps special fuel, and a parachute, popping from the rear, regains control over this man-carrying explosion. What's the point of it all? Partly to show what one mean machine can do, partly because it's fun to go fast. You might think that going around and around gets you nowhere, but it may take you around the world or into orbit around the moon. In smaller circles, going around lets you make things and have fun. Needing to know when it was time to pray and fascinated by the regular motions of the stars, medieval Arabs used the astrolabe, a complex device that allows its user to measure the angle between a star and the horizon and to calculate what time it is. It also came in handy in casting horoscopes. Various versions of the astrolabe spread throughout Europe in the Middle Ages. On this one, dogs' heads represent major stars, and there's a bonus feature on the back, a special form of sundial. This instrument was made in England around 1600, with the sundial added later. Voyager, stained and weather-beaten after 9 racking days of steady flight, hangs above an entrance to the National Air and Space Museum. In December 1986, with Dick Rutan and Gina Yeager crammed in its tiny cabin, this delicate space-age airplane pulled off one of the last epic flights, non-stop around the world without refueling.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
This 1864 Mill engine still runs, though no longer on steam. That mighty flywheel whispers around and around, belts slap, cylinders pant, valves click, shafts hum, and the connecting rod pumps with a steady power that awed the 19th century. Back in '46, for the price of a nickel, you got Goodman or Dorsey, Bing Crosby or Harry James. Boys just back from overseas big-appled with girls in bobby socks, while the music went round and round on the bright, brand-new Wurlitzer. Dedicated to preservation, the Smithsonian has a passion for collecting traces of lives and ways of life going or already gone from our planet. Long before there were humans around for it to pester, a fly got its wing caught in the sap of a Baltic pine tree. Though the sap turned to amber, the carbon within the wing remained to etch its outline and show us that a fly was a fly, even 38 million years ago. This drawing in colored inks on deer hide shows the famous ghost dance of the late 1880s. Cheyennes and Arapahoes in a circle, men wearing feathers, women with long hair. Some wave handkerchiefs to increase the hypnotic effect brought on by the dance. The ghost dance was a religious outpouring influenced by Christianity, taught by an Indian messiah named Wovoka. He promised the end of the whites, the return of the bison-rich ancestral lands, if the Indians practiced peace and goodwill. But nervous whites feared rebellion and sent the army to break up Indian ceremonies. The buffalo did not return, and the hope of the ghost dance became a sad footnote to the history of the West. The Smithsonian celebrates the People's Republic of China gave these giant pandas, Ling Ling and Sing Sing, to the United States in 1972. Since then, they've entertained visitors to the National Zoo with their personalities and titillated the whole country with their attempts to propagate. It's no trivial matter. These adorable creatures face the danger of extinction. The sinuous shape of this obsolete bass wind instrument gave it its name. The form was quite practical, bringing the finger holes and keys within reach of the player. We need heroes the way we need oxygen. We may find them in the White House, in the house next door, or in our own home. Heroism comes in many forms, flamboyant or quiet, in victory or in defeat. Did anyone ever see Washington nude? Asked Nathaniel Hawthorne. It is inconceivable. But sculptor Horatio Greenough, infected by the classical revival of the 1840s, made the great American hero into a half-naked Roman emperor. After a history of mishaps, mostly resulting from its 12-ton weight, the statue sat outside the Capitol for half a century, shocking prudish Victorians, until the Smithsonian acquired it. In 1835, Osceola, leader of the Florida Seminoles, was asked to sign a treaty giving up his people's lands. His response was to plunge a dagger through the paper. For 3 years, Osceola and his little band outsmarted the United States Army in guerrilla warfare. Finally, the frustrated American general declared a truce. Osceola, arriving under a white flag, was seized and thrown into prison. 3 months later, the true hero of the inglorious Seminole Wars was dead. Thomas Akins's portrait of his wife caused a sensation in 1899 when tastes in portraiture were not ready for such uncompromising realism. Akins sought beauty in truth, and his wife's face reflects the endless patience and quiet courage of a woman who made her own artistic career secondary to her husband's, and who stood by him through years of frustrated hopes and dampened ambitions. Isabel Nagel, a lady from Boston, was vacationing in Paris when she met an intense young man, an art student named Gaston Lachaise. He followed her to America and proceeded to create a series of bronze statues. Lachaise produced dozens such majestic nudes, all inspired by Isabel, who eventually married him. Unless you're a soccer fan, you might not recognize this white shirt with the green numeral. But some 900 million people all over the world know it well. It's the shirt the great Pelé wore when he last played for Brazil in the 1970 World Cup. Pelé, real name Edson Arantes do Nascimento, learned soccer as a poverty-stricken kid, booting a sock stuffed with newspaper. He went on to lead his country to the game's only three-time world championship. Auguste Rodin molded his public monument, the Burghers of Calais, in 1886. Breaking sharply with the smooth, idealized statues that people were used to. The figures depict an event in the 100 Years' War. In order to save their town, 6 men voluntarily gave themselves up for execution. Rodin's harsh modeling displays their inner torment, a shockingly personal revelation. Though the animal kingdom offers endless variety, human imagination keeps going one step farther. Here's a menagerie of creatures that nature neglected or left behind. "5,000 years ago, an artist created this image of animal power, nostrils flaring, fire in its ivory eyes. Pre-Hittite peoples of Asia Minor venerated the bull, and the figure may have been used in rituals. The stand rising from its back held some kind of cup. There was still a lot to learn about metalworking. A hind leg broke off, but this artist knew all about the strength and fierce beauty of a bull. In the summer of 1909, Dr. Charles Walcott, secretary of the Smithsonian, clopped through the Canadian Rockies on a fossil-collecting pack trip. The story goes that his horse stumbled on a piece of shale. Cracking it open, paleontologist Walcott found seabed fossils never before seen. One tiny specimen walked on 7 pairs of stilts, waving 7 antennae. Another, 3 inches long, slithered along the sea bottom with no legs at all. It spotted its prey with 5 bulging eyes and reached out with a single fingered arm. The Burgess Shale held some 140 species, fossils that vastly increased our knowledge of life in the Cambrian era, 530 million years ago. Youthful visitors to the Hirshhorn generally react the same way when they see this dog sculpted in 1951 by Alberto Giacometti. "Feed him," they say. "He's hungry." The Swiss-born artist later recalled, "I was walking in the rain, close to the walls of the buildings, my head down, a little sad, and I felt like a dog just then. That's why I made that sculpture. Jade is prized everywhere, but only in China have artists worked this extremely hard stone into such intricate and beautiful shapes as this mystical chimera, part lion, part dragon, carved about 2,000 years ago. A grotesque, not quite human figure kneels on the immortal beast, clutching its mane. In many parts of Africa, a diviner plays the role of pharmacist and psychologist, the person who treats a cold and explains misfortune and unhappiness. This figure, hung with charms, could have helped a diviner to tell the future, to ward off misfortune, or to cure an illness. The story goes that President Theodore Roosevelt, on one of his frequent hunting trips, refused to shoot a cute bear cub. Artist Clifford Berryman used the little bear in a Washington Star cartoon. A Russian immigrant couple, Morris Mitchum and his wife, saw the cartoon, hand-sewed this plush bear, and sent it to Roosevelt. The bear was such a hit that the Mitchums went on to found the Ideal Toy Company. Shelter is a basic need, but there's nothing basic about the amazing variety of environments that we humans have created for ourselves. Andrew Carnegie wanted the most modest, plainest, and roomiest house in New York, and the little Scottish steel tycoon generally got what he wanted. In the richly paneled hallway, Carnegie and his family welcomed the likes of Eve Curie, John Paderewski, and Mark Twain. The Smithsonian acquired the house in 1972, and now hundreds of visitors come to see the Cooper Hewitt collections and to touch the grandeur of a vanished time. William Morris, artist, designer, poet, novelist, and philosopher, believed that beauty belongs in any place where people live and work. He revolutionized Victorian taste by founding the arts and crafts movement, and he designed lovely wallpaper patterns like this, called the Pimpernel.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2.
Throughout his life, Edward Hopper ignored art movements and kept at his lonely paintings like 11 a.m., done in 1926. A woman, naked except for her shoes, sits looking out a window. The title tells us the time of day, but there are no clues to why she is there or what she is looking at. If she were not there, the room would be almost an abstraction, a study of geometric shapes and colors. James McNeill Whistler's Peacock Room is one of the Smithsonian's most extraordinary treasures. This was the London dining room of Whistler's patron, British shipping magnate Frederick Leyland. Leyland wanted the room redecorated to show off his porcelain collection and a Whistler painting he owned, The Princess from the Land of Porcelain. He asked the artist to give the hired decorator a little advice. The expatriate American agreed, and then, in Leyland's absence, simply took over the entire job. He moved into his patron's townhouse and began a total transformation of the room. In a fever of inspiration, Whistler slathered paint over Leyland's priceless leather wall coverings. Lying on his back, he would dab at the ceiling with a paintbrush tied to the end of a fishing rod. Paint spattered, hair twinkling with bits of gold leaf, he entertained friends from London society, once dancing with a blue-blooded lady among his paint pots. Leyland heard rumors of Whistler's hijinks and hurried home. When he saw the room, he was aghast. He called Whistler an artistic Barnum, ordered him out and paid him off in pounds as if he were a tradesman instead of the guineas expected by a professional artist. Whistler jabbed back at this insult by adding a finishing touch to the wall that Leyland faced every evening while dining. One peacock guards a hoard of gold and silver coins, while the other walks away, poor but proud. Where's the Museum of Music, visitors to the Smithsonian sometimes ask. In fact, there is no single building devoted to music, but on the other hand, music, sometimes familiar, sometimes unexpected, flows from every museum and gallery. One of the few surviving cellos made by master craftsman Antonio Stradivari is the Servet, named after Adrien Francois Servet, a 19th century Belgian virtuoso. According to one account, a Russian princess, ecstatic over Servet's playing, gave him the instrument as a gift. When you hear the music that Servet wrote to show off his skill and the extraordinary sound of his cello, you can understand the princess's reaction. A century ago, some forgotten craftsman put together this fiddle from a gourd, some wood, some bone, a few nails, and an animal hide. Found on the site of a plantation in Maryland, it was probably used to play music of a Black American heritage. Thumb pianos of various types accompany singing and dancing all over Africa. This one, less than 9 inches long, comes from the Chukwe people of Zaire. You hold it in both hands and pluck the keys with your thumbs. As a boy in Virginia, Joel Walker Sweeney learned to play the banjo from slaves on his family's plantation. He went on to win fame as the first great minstrel show banjo player. Sweeney may well have played this banjo, made by his friend, William Boucher.
Went down the road one morning, we got up soon.
Little Garfield went to walking down the road. And big Garfield got up, you know, and out the door.
A harpsichord of 1760 made in Paris is one of several in the Smithsonian collection. Craftsmen at the institution restore many such instruments to playable condition so music lovers of today can hear the tones of a more gracious age. The sinuous shape of this obsolete bass wind instrument gave it its name. The form was quite practical, bringing the finger holes and keys within reach of the player. In much of the rural Southeast, Appalachian dulcimers like this one still accompany folk songs passed down for generations. Every summer, the Smithsonian's Folklife Festival brings many of the country's folk singers to the mall, some of them bearing dulcimers. You hold the instrument level and pluck the strings with a quill from a goose or turkey. The zest for adornment produced this head on one of the Smithsonian's great treasures, a bass viola da gamba made in London in 1718. You can hear the viola da gamba's light, graceful tone in this duet with a lute, courtly sounds from 17th century France. A harp brought out of Zaire around the turn of the century holds a place of honor in the Museum of African Art. Traveling musicians strummed on it as they told their stories before villagers and chieftains. Some say that making a big deal out of the simple need for nourishment is a mark of civilization. The original owners of these objects, spanning 3,000 years, would probably agree. You press down on the stylized owl, and that lifts the dragon, and then, my dear, you can sip some Madeira. You're drinking out of a very precious Chinese bronze, a ritual wine server called a guang. It dates from the 12th century BC. To make the guang, metalsmiths fashioned a clay mold of each section, joined the sections together, and poured in the molten bronze. Presumably, the wine tasted great. The blue and white porcelain ware that the Western world calls China has been around since the 14th century when cobalt blue arrived in China. This early example shows how deep the blue went, almost navy. The carp swimming in eelgrass was a popular Yuan dynasty motif. It may have tied in with the story of a Taoist hermit, Qin Gao, who once took a ride on a giant carp. How would you like to sip wine from the head of one of Bambi's friends? Actually, this silver and gilt rhyton, or drinking horn, bears no relationship to Walt Disney's animals except for those appealing eyes. Symbolic animals are etched around the cup. A Persian ruler or official used it in the 4th century AD. When a design is pleasing and works well, why change it? Anyone today would recognize this vessel as a canteen, even though it's 7 centuries old. It's Syrian, made of brass inlaid with silver. The intricate decorations are both Islamic and Christian. Here you see a nativity scene with saints and angels. Arabic writing around the rim says, "Power eternal and secure life, riches, happiness, and power enduring, and perfect health in perpetuity to the possessor." That's a pretty thorough toast. George Washington lost his first tooth when only 22, and all the rest by the time he became president. In 1795, he got the teeth shown here, elephant and hippopotamus ivory set in gold with strong springs to hold them against the gums. Throughout the years, Washington wore many sets. Some used tiny wooden dowels to hold parts together. This may explain the totally false legend that George Washington wore wooden teeth. President Washington coped with embarrassing clicks and snaps, with soreness and indigestion, with having to clean off the stains of port wine, and sometimes stuff his mouth with rolls of cotton. He bore the discomfort like an old soldier. But it was a blow to the vanity of a man who had once been handsome. John Singer Sargent forsook portraiture to do this sunny scene in 1910, Breakfast in the Loggia. The two ladies, fashionable friends of the artist, stretch out their morning meal in animated society gossip. Sargent's rapid, skillful brushwork captures the feel of rustling breezes warmed by the summer sun. In a mechanized world, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by machines of wires, wheels, plastic, and steel. Here are some treasures that bring us back to our most fundamental machinery: human muscles. Muhammad Ali used to say he was the greatest, and a good many boxing experts agree. We humans have always felt a yen to leap from earth to sky. We tried with kites and wings, with gas-filled balloons and engine-driven aircraft, but never under our own power until 1977. Then a fragile push-pedal plane called the Gossamer Condor fulfilled the dream. Heavier than air flight, powered by nothing but human muscles. Dr. B. Frank Palmer, one of those ingenious Yankees of the 19th century, won a place in the Smithsonian with his award-winning artificial leg. It seems that Palmer lost his own leg and, finding no prosthetic device to his liking, set about inventing a good one. Palmer's patent leg was one of the hits of London's huge Crystal Palace exhibition of 1851. Where it helped establish our American reputation for inventiveness. This is a bicycle? It sure is. In fact, it's the These treasures celebrate night spots and bright lights, and a few people who were known to enjoy a good night on the town. This plated silver penguin would have been right at home in any smart modern household of the 1930s. With those sleek lines, it looks like a sculpture, but it's really a cocktail shaker. It held martinis in its ice-cold little belly and dispensed them through its friendly little beak. Back in '46 for the Meet the girl on the red velvet swing, Evelyn Nesbit, Miss Sex Kitten of 1901. She came from Pittsburgh, from the wrong side of the tracks, went to New York as a teenager and began a modeling career. Photographer Rudolf Eichemeyer posed and snapped her in exotic settings. Through Eichemeyer, Evelyn met architect Stanford White, who, in the contemporary phrase, made her a woman. Pittsburgh steel baron Harry Thaw married Evelyn first, asked questions later. When he learned the truth, he tracked Stanny White to a theater club and shot him, right in front of cast, orchestra, and audience. Thaw was, understandably, bustled off to an asylum. Meanwhile, Eichemeyer's photos of Evelyn went on selling like hotcakes, shaping an era's conception of beauty. Here stands a special kind of American, Isaac Merritt Singer, self-made nabob of the post-Civil War age of greed. He made a huge fortune by improving on Elias Howe's sewing machine, splurged his money enthusiastically on a series of mistresses, got into trouble for choking his common-law wife, got out of trouble again, and lived out his days in Paris. Portraitist Edward Harrison May caught to perfection Singer's aura of arrogant profligacy. A house can be a lot more than a home, especially if you're talking about the architecture that houses the Smithsonian Institution. Here are some places and spaces that stand as Smithsonian treasures in their own right. About 10 million people swarm into the National Air and Space Museum every year. That makes it the world's most visited museum. Architect Gio Obata won an award for the building with its glass-bubbled ceilings that seem to put air and space themselves on display. The Museum of Arts and Industries is the Smithsonian's second building, begun in 1879 and finished in time for President Garfield's inaugural ball in 1881. Its main claim to fame is that it's the cheapest building that the government ever put up in Washington. Cheap but nice if you like the lively colors and crazy patterns of Victorian Romanesque. Andrew Carnegie wanted the most modest, plainest, and roomiest house in New York, and the little Scottish steel tycoon generally got what he wanted. In the richly paneled hallway, Carnegie and his family welcomed the likes of Eve Curie, John Paderewski, and Mark Twain. The Smithsonian acquired the house in 1972, and now hundreds of visitors come to see the Cooper Hewitt collections and to touch the grandeur of a vanished time. We call it the Castle. It's the original Smithsonian building designed by James Renwick and built in the 1840s and 50s in a style perhaps best described as Victorian folly. During the Civil War, the tower offered a view of both army camps. However, the fire that raged through the castle in 1865 was caused by a wrongly connected stovepipe, not by Confederate cannon shells. Today, one of 8 monumental Smithsonian structures on Washington's famous Mall, the castle is still the administrative heart of the institution. Just west of the Smithsonian Castle stands the quiet and austere Freer Gallery. Its Italian Renaissance facades are tasteful and satisfying, formal yet also private. No wonder. Charles Lang Freer planned it as his own personal museum. Freer, a self-made railroad tycoon, spent years tracking down art treasures all over Asia. At his death in 1919, Freer made his priceless collection, with funds for a building to house it, a gift to the nation. The Patent Office building was a Washington landmark even before the Civil War. A temple of the useful arts, it housed patent models and the national collection of artistic and historic items. When the war erupted, the building became a barracks, then a hospital, with 2,000 beds for the Union wounded. By 1865, the great spaces were once again available for events such as Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural ball. In 1962, the Smithsonian rescued the old patent office from becoming a parking lot. Today, the grand old building houses 2 great Smithsonian collections, the National Portrait Gallery and the Museum of American Art. It's hard to believe that the Renwick Gallery was, as recently as the early 1960s, a grim government edifice housing the United States Court of Claims. Then the Smithsonian acquired the building and went to work on it. The building began to glow again with the exuberance of the French Renaissance, the style that architect James Renwick adopted in 1859 when he designed this, Washington's first public art museum. Here is the Smithsonian's buried treasure, a 3-story complex of museums, educational centers, and offices. The quad, that is, the quadrangle, was over 20 years in the planning and building. Here you find the Museum of African Art, the Arthur M. Sackler Gallery, and the S. Dillon Ripley Center, which is a complex of offices, classrooms, and exhibit spaces. And it's all invisible, 60 feet below the Enid A. Haupt Garden. In many ways, the Civil War was the crucible that formed our national identity. The Smithsonian holds a priceless legacy of faces from that war. Here are a few of them. At the end of the 19th century, Frederick Hill Meserve devoted himself to amassing photographs from the Civil War days. He gathered so many that the National Portrait Gallery displays them in rotation, a small part of the collection at a time. Meserve's gift to the Smithsonian is one of the nation's great historical treasures, a priceless visual record of the leaders and the little people of a crucial era in our history.
Well, whosoever will, let him come, let him come.
Frederick Douglass escaped from slavery and bought his freedom with the earnings from his lectures at home and abroad on the abolitionist cause. During the Civil War, he helped raise 2 black regiments, and he was a friend and advisor to Abraham Lincoln. The portrait's handsome case, with its red velvet cushion, served to protect the fragile ambrotype.
Let him come, well, and whosoever will, let him come and drink from the fountain of life.
According to tradition, Abraham Lincoln sat for this photograph at the Washington studio of Alexander Gardner on April 10, 1865. The glass plate negative cracked during the printing process, and Gardner threw it away after making just this one print, now in the Meserve collection. Gardner caught the president the day after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. The end of the terrible war brought the beginnings of a tired smile. Within a few days, Lincoln was dead, struck down by an assassin's bullet only 3 blocks away from the photographer's studio. In Peter Balling's portrait, General Ulysses S. Grant seems a bit tired and messy, his tunic unbuttoned to reveal a pink shirt. His wife said that he was like that, at least when on active duty. And the frame is a wonder, with that eagle peering down to see if it really is the general. Wearied and heartbroken after his surrender, Robert E. Lee was sought out in Richmond by Matthew Brady. The great and gracious general consented to don once more the old rebel gray and sit for a portrait. This treasure of the National Portrait Gallery. A symbol evokes something larger and more important than itself. Here's a mixed bag of objects, all symbolic of some greater substance. This coin was worth $20 until 1933, when we went off the gold standard. But that vigorous figure of liberty and that graceful eagle are worth a whole lot more. They're the work of sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens, commissioned in 1907 by his friend President Theodore Roosevelt, who wanted to make our gold coins look bully. The trouble was, St. Gaudens's bas-reliefs were too high for the U.S. Mint to handle. This 1907 coin from the Smithsonian collection had to be leveled down a little before it could be produced. Yes, the flag that Francis Scott Key looked for through the smoke that morning is still there. The Star-Spangled Banner was made during the War of 1812 by Mary Pickersgill of Baltimore, to the order of Fort McHenry's commanding officer, who asked for an ensign that the British fleet could see at a distance. So could an American lawyer and sometime poet held captive on a British warship. His name was Francis Scott Key. After its taste of battle, the flag was stored away, its rotting remnant finally reaching the Smithsonian in 1907. A team of seamstresses sewed the old relic onto a linen backing, carefully including that strange red V on the white stripe, which no one can explain. Asante women of Ghana carry small figures like these at the small of the back, believing that they encourage the conception of beautiful, healthy babies. This set of two sculptures, a male and a female sitting back to back, is unusual. It may have been kept in a shrine.
Ah, sweet and lovely are those days of which I dream.
Sojourner Truth, abolitionist, suffragist, and evangelist of Civil War days. In 1864, she visited Washington to help integrate streetcars, almost a century before Rosa Parks's Alabama bus ride. Lincoln received her at the White House. She never learned to read or write, but when she talked, huge crowds listened. As she explains under her picture, Sojourner sold copies of this card, her shadow, to pay expenses.
Pray again, my Lord, and if I could hear her tender voice again.
Most machines replace muscle, but some of our cleverest inventions extend the power of our minds. It turns out that artificial intelligence goes back a long way. The earliest computers were slow, unreliable, and enormous, occupying entire rooms. The equivalent of thousands of these rooms today can be incised on a tiny chip of silicate, the microprocessor. From the outside, a chip is about as interesting as a lump of coal. On the inside, a microscopic city manipulates amazing amounts of information. In fact, a chip like this one is bringing you these sights and sounds right now. Here is a distant ancestor of the handheld calculator you bought at your local drugstore to help figure your income tax. In the mid-1800s, tinkerer George Scheutz tried to make higher math a little less onerous. He invented this mechanical device and called it a difference engine. It calculated tables of numbers and printed them out, making life a little easier for insurance actuaries, astronomers, and navigators. A French hand loom from Lyon has an attachment that automates the selection of yarns to weave patterns. It consists of a series of cards, each punched with holes to which the loom reacts. The idea of keeping information in the form of punched cards became a vital step in the development of the computer. This was the brainchild of Joseph-Marie Jacquard, who introduced his extraordinary loom in 1804. Needing to know when it was time to pray and whether by hand or machine, threads and patches can stitch together quilts, a saddle, or a basket, not to mention a few scalps and the odd elephant.
When I get sick and I have to go to bed, I send for the Lulu to hold my head.
Crazy quilts are still fun to make. They take forever, but it's a social sort of chore with friends dropping in to help, amid chatter and laughter and morning coffee. There's no hurry about making a crazy quilt. This one took 16 years. The process is wonderfully serendipitous. The pieces are arranged with careful asymmetry and a meticulous eye to contrasting colors. Fancy stitching of imaginative design binds them. Buds and blossoms go everywhere. There's even room for a nice old baby carriage. A French hand loom from Lyon has an attachment that automates the selection of yarns to weave patterns. It consists of a series of cards, each punched with holes to which the loom reacts. The idea of keeping information in the form of punched cards became a vital step in the development of the computer. This was the brainchild of Joseph-Marie Jacquard.
Me quisiera acordar y era una tarde de invierno.
Lavish silver adornments and a dinner plate saddle horn mark this as a Mexican landowner's saddle. Actually, it was a gift to General Philip H. Sheridan in 1866. With the Civil War finally over, Fighting Phil was commanding a division in Texas, occasionally lending a hand to Mexicans who were struggling to free themselves from their Austrian-born would-be emperor Maximilian. This saddle is an expression of gratitude to Sheridan from a patriotic and wealthy Mexican landowner. The sewing machine was the work of many inventors, most notably Elias Howe. But Isaac Merritt Singer, a would-be actor, took time out from his uncertain career to perfect Howe's machine. For one thing, it was Singer's idea that the needle move up and down rather than sideways. Demonstrated in showrooms by attractive women, the Singer sewing machine sold by the thousands and revolutionized the garment industry. Here's the official greeter at the Museum of Natural History. It's the world's largest stuffed animal, an African bush elephant. It dominates visitors in the rotunda just as it once lorded over its herd. What a stitching job this was for a taxidermist. This shirt belonged to Kicking Bear, a warrior of the plains and a powerful chief of the Miniconjou Sioux. He was on the winning side at the Battle of Little Bighorn, where General George Custer and his command were wiped out. Years later, when he sat for this portrait, Kicking Bear wore his ceremonial shirt. Among the decorations are human scalps taken in battle. Money can't buy happiness, says the old saw. But after sampling these expensive playthings, you begin to wonder. It's called the Hope, not the world's largest diamond, but the world's largest dark blue diamond, famous for the curse it allegedly carries. Unfortunately for story lovers, tales of the Hope diamond afflicting its owners with madness, ruination, or grisly death are hogwash. Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, a French traveler who bought the stone in India and brought it to France, was not torn to shreds by wild dogs, as the story claimed. He sold the diamond to Louis XIV, who passed it on to Louis XV, shown here wearing it as part of a decoration called the Golden Fleece. With the French Revolution, the diamond made its way to England. Eventually, the flamboyant American jet-setter Evelyn Walsh McLean received it as a gift from her husband. Evelyn, who never minded a little attention, embellished the legends about her trinket for all she was worth. Most of its owners lived well and died old, but the curse has made the Hope diamond the most fabled jewel in the world. Imagine wearing these brass anklets more than 14 inches in diameter on a visit to the supermarket. Yet an Igbo woman of Nigeria suffered them gladly, for their awkward size made her wealth and prestige abundantly clear. The metal plates were hammered and chased with symbolic designs. The ornate decor of the Brighton Royal Pavilion recalls the profligate George IV, who, when he was England's Prince Regent, had it built as his pleasure dome. Price was no object for designer Frederick Crace, whose decorations create a royal fantasy world that seems to belong somewhere between the exotic Far East and ancient Rome. In these surroundings, the obese princeling supped, gorged, and frolicked with his mistresses. Louis Comfort Tiffany designed this blown glass vase to get the full effect of the iridescence of colored glass. Tiffany worked out a way to achieve the feeling of lustrous gold lines streaming upward and swirling outward as the vase broadens at the mouth. This plated silver penguin would have been right at home in any smart modern household of the 1930s. With those sleek lines, it looks like a sculpture, but it's really a cocktail shaker. It held martinis in its ice-cold little belly and dispensed them through its friendly little beak. George Washington is remembered at the Smithsonian with a variety of things he owned, knew, saw, or touched. They give us a glimpse of the man behind the monuments. Of all the Smithsonian's Washington portraits, this pair of George and Martha by Gilbert Stuart are the most famous. Stuart began them in 1796, but left them unfinished, something of a habit with him. Our First Lady was also our shortest, 5 feet 2, and certainly one of the nicest, a serene counterpart to her restless, impatient husband. A lifetime of responsibility and the endless bickering of Congress had aged the general. While posing, he reacted coldly to the artist's pleasantries. Stuart retaliated by painting those pursed lips and cold eyes. Incidentally, these portraits aren't always at the National Gallery. By special agreement, George and Martha alternate every 3 years at Boston's Museum of Fine Arts. Family legend says this is the uniform that George Washington wore when he resigned his commission at Annapolis, Maryland at the end of the Revolutionary War. Compare the uniform with this statue by Houdon, and you get a pretty good idea of how Washington looked. A tall, trim, athletic man with long arms and oversized hands that he sometimes hid in embarrassment. The general's coat and pants are in the traditional buff and dark blue of a general officer. Of all the uniforms used in the American Revolution, fewer than 10 survive. Did anyone ever see Washington nude? Asked Nathaniel Hawthorne. It is inconceivable. But sculptor Horatio Greenough, infected by the classical revival of the 1840s, made the great American hero into a half-naked Roman emperor. George Washington lost his first tooth when only 22, and all the rest by the time he became president. In 1795, he got the teeth shown here, elephant and hippopotamus ivory set in gold with strong springs to hold them against the gums. Throughout the years, Washington wore many sets. Some used tiny wooden dowels to hold parts together. This may explain the totally false legend that George Washington wore wooden teeth. President Washington coped with embarrassing clicks and snaps with soreness and indigestion, with having to clean off the stains of port wine, and sometimes stuff his mouth with rolls of cotton. He bore the discomfort like an old soldier. But it was a blow to the vanity of a man who had once been handsome. When Benjamin Franklin died in 1790, he left these words in his will: "My fine crabtree walking stick with a gold head curiously wrought in the form of a cap of liberty, I give to my friend and the friend of mankind, General Washington. If it were a scepter, he has merited it and would become it." Water is everywhere at the Smithsonian, in ships that sailed across it, in fish that called it home, and in works of art from all over the world. High Cliff, coast of Maine, one of Winslow Homer's many evocations of the New England seascape, captures the immensity of nature's power. The tiny human figures in one corner seem almost irrelevant in this primal world of water, wind, and stone. The Chinese know that rivers mean life itself. An album from the early 1600s contains 8 paintings, 2 each by 4 artists, all depicting river country. Rain-washed and sunny, always a little misty, sometimes with fog hanging low, sometimes in swirling masses. Meticulous foliage, hillsides and houses, and small, intent humans stand out against open space where the water flows. Waves at Matsushima, it's called, a painting on a folding screen by Sotatsu, an eminent Japanese artist of the 17th century Edo period. Golden waves sweep turbulently around bluffs of land where wind-whipped trees cling. Details show rolling, wind-streaked waves, eddies, tiny whirlpools, the curling flecks of the whitecaps. No wonder Sotatsu had a reputation for vigor. The history of America is a story of westward movement, a discovery of exotic cultures, spectacular landscapes, and limitless opportunity. Albert Bierstadt, German-born New Englander, studied landscape painting in Europe. In 1859, he joined a surveying expedition and toured the American West on horseback. 9 years later, in a studio in Rome, He captured the majesty of that untouched wilderness in this vision of an American Valhalla. Artist George Catlin collected these artifacts of Plains Indian tribes in the 1830s, before their way of life was changed forever. As a young painter in Philadelphia, Catlin saw some Western Indians on their way to meet the president, and he decided to paint them while their culture still existed. For 8 years he roamed the Great Plains of the Missouri Territory, painting and collecting objects. Catlin later displayed his artifacts and paintings to Easterners and Europeans for a fee. He never made much money, but the skin clothing, the beaded bag, the snowshoes, the elk antler war club made to look like a heron's head, all remain as priceless mementos of the first Americans. Thomas Jefferson started the tradition of meeting the chiefs of Indian tribes and giving them medals like this one, tokens of peace and friendship. Throughout the 19th century, chieftains from Western tribes, Geronimo, for example, made the long journey to Washington, received the medal, and kept it for life. Most recipients, in fact, were buried with their medals, so they're very rare today. Conestoga, Pennsylvania gave its name to the sturdy freight wagons first built there. For over a century, these wagons played a homely but crucial part in American history. They had wide wheels to cope with deep mud, and they were always blue with red wheels and white hooped canvas covers. The largest model, with a body designed to float across rivers, became the famous prairie schooner that carried hordes of immigrants to the opening West. Built in the nation's centennial year, 1876, this Baldwin locomotive stars in the Centennial Exhibition at the Arts and Industries Building. This little engine that could worked originally for the Santa Cruz Railroad in California. It was still chugging away in Guatemala in 1950. Thomas Moran, born and raised in the East, was stunned by the grandeur of Western scenery when he first saw it as artist for a geological survey party. Like Easterners even today, Moran felt deeply the impact of startling colors, towering heights, an immensity of untouched earth and sky. Intriguing, archaic, mysterious. The Smithsonian's a storehouse of items that provoke the question, what is that? Simple jade discs called pi were laboriously ground by ancient Chinese craftsmen as long ago as 1,000 years BC. The discs may have been used in stargazing and heaven worship. No one knows for sure. This one, with its splendid dragon, comes from the Han period, which lasted from 206 BC to 220 AD. Match safes were little containers for those nice old-fashioned matches that a pipe smoker could light on his thumbnail or the seat of his pants. The idea of the safe was to keep the smoker from igniting himself by accident. The Cooper Hewitt has more than 4,000 match safes in every conceivable shape. This charming fellow lives in the insect zoo at the Museum of Natural History, along with thousands of other arthropods. At visiting hours, youngsters and their sometimes reluctant parents can meet face-to-face with the crawly creatures while a loudspeaker amplifies their chirps, creaks, and hums. Thumb pianos of various types accompany singing and dancing all over Africa. This one, less than 9 inches long, comes from the Chukwe people of Zaire. You hold it in both hands and pluck the keys with your thumbs. From the first human voice to today's global village, it's words that get the message across. These treasures celebrate words in the faces of writers and the tools they use to compose and communicate. A young Ernest Hemingway posed in 1923 for Man Ray's camera. The bandaged head fits nicely with the author's reputation for getting himself wounded in wars and sports, but the fact is he got this wound in an accident with the photographer's bathroom window. The hat over the bandage was Man Ray's idea, but the jaunty expression is all Hemingway. Thomas Jefferson designed this portable folding desk himself and wrote the Declaration of Independence on it. The open drawer shows ink stains, spilled perhaps as he fussed over phrases like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Here in the Meserve collection of early photographs is Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, whose poems like The Chambered Nautilus and The Deacon's Masterpiece are part of the fabric of our cultural history. Holmes was a quick and restless man, just 5'3" in his elevator shoes. His spirited intelligence shines through in Matthew Brady's portrait. What hath God wrought? These were the words of the world's first single-wire electronic message sent on this telegraph key in 1844. The words traveled instantly from Washington to Baltimore, tapped out in a code of dots and dashes by inventor Samuel F.B. Morse. Here is a 13th century portrait of Saigu Nyogo Yoshiko, a princess and one of Japan's 36 greatest classical poets. The artist depicts her as shy and retiring, to put it mildly. She lies on her tatami mat, curled up amid the 12 stiff layers of her robe. You can just barely see her head peeking out.